August 6, 1945. A blinding flash split the sky over Hiroshima. In seconds, a city turned to ash. And behind that decision stood one man. A man both praised as a savior and damned as a destroyer. Who was he? And what led him to the most devastating decision in human history? This is the story of Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States. A farmer, a soldier, a senator, and then suddenly, a man with the weight of the world's deadliest weapon in his hands. Few leaders have faced the moral and military dilemmas Truman did. Fewer still have changed the course of history with a single command. But Truman did. This documentary unravels not just the facts, but the man behind the mushroom cloud. His rise from obscurity, the crushing weight of his presidency, the Cold War's birth, and how his legacy haunts the corridors of power to this day. Compass Part 1. From Farm to the Front Lines of Power. Harry S. Truman was born on May 8, 1884, in the small town of Lamar, Missouri. He wasn't born into privilege or destined for greatness. Raised on a farm, Truman wore thick glasses, read voraciously, and worked hard in the fields. His early life was a humble one, full of sweat, soil, and silent ambition. Truman's journey to power was anything but inevitable. He fought in World War I, leading an artillery unit in France with distinction. Though not a natural-born politician, he rose steadily, gaining a reputation for honesty, loyalty, and resilience. His break came under the wing of Kansas City political boss Tom Pendergast, whose influence helped Truman win a Senate seat. Though associated with machine politics, Truman proved unexpectedly independent. His wartime oversight committee saved billions of dollars and earned bipartisan respect. And then fate intervened. Mantelpiece Clock Part 2, A Vice President in the Shadows. In 1944, as Franklin D. Roosevelt ran for an unprecedented fourth term, party leaders sought a safer, more moderate running mate. FDR, a fading giant of history, picked Truman, a quiet, reliable figure the public barely knew. Truman was in the dark on the biggest issues of the war. He didn't even know about the Manhattan Project. But everything changed on April 12, 1945, when FDR died suddenly. Truman, stunned, was sworn in. "I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me," he said. He had no transition, no preparation. And within weeks, he would inherit the most destructive weapon the world had ever seen. Radioactive Part 3, The Decision, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When Truman learned of the Manhattan Project, a secret $2 billion effort to build an atomic bomb, he was stunned. Scientists at Los Alamos had done the impossible. The bomb was ready. Now the decision rested with Truman. The war in Europe was over. But Japan refused unconditional surrender. The Pacific conflict was brutal. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, kamikaze raids. An invasion of Japan was projected to cost over 1 million Allied lives. On July 25, 1945, after intense deliberation and advice from military leaders, Truman approved the use of the atomic bomb. On August 6, Hiroshima was obliterated. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Over 200,000 Japanese civilians died in the blasts and aftermath. Truman stood firm. "I regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubt that it should be used," he later said. But the world would never be the same again. Globe showing Europe-Africa Part 4, A New World Order, The Cold War begins. The bombs ended the war, but they also began something else. The Soviet Union, Truman's uneasy wartime ally, now became his ideological rival. The shared victory of World War II quickly froze into Cold War tension. Truman took a hard line against communism. In 1947, he announced the Truman Doctrine, pledging to support nations resisting Soviet influence. That same year, he approved the Marshall Plan, injecting billions into rebuilding Europe, not just as aid but as a bulwark against communism. Berlin was blockaded. NATO was born. Korea soon erupted into war. And Truman, once underestimated, was now reshaping the post-war world order. Classical Building Part 5, At Home, a president of firsts and fierce choices. Truman wasn't just a wartime president. On the home front, he made bold, controversial moves. He desegregated the U.S. military in 1948, decades before the civil rights movement took national stage. He fought against discrimination, proposed national health care, and challenged corporate monopolies. And against all odds, he won re-election in 1948, defeating Thomas Dewey in what is still considered the biggest upset in American political history. But the weight of global conflicts, economic strain, and partisan divides wore on him. Compass Part 6, The Burden of Power, The Final Years in Office. By 1950, the Cold War had reached a boiling point. On June 25, North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel, invading South Korea. Truman, determined to contain communism, committed U.S. forces under the banner of the United Nations. The Korean War had begun, a brutal, grinding conflict that would shape the geopolitics of Asia for decades. But the war was not going as smoothly as hoped. General Douglas MacArthur, a popular but defiant figure, pushed for expanded war, even suggesting the use of nuclear weapons against China. Truman, fearful of triggering World War III, relieved him of command. The backlash was fierce. Truman's approval ratings plummeted. At home he faced growing unrest. Strikes disrupted the economy. Inflation soared. And the Red Scare, fueled by Senator Joseph McCarthy, turned political discourse into a frenzy of accusations and fear. Though Truman despised McCarthyism, he struggled to control its spread. By 1952, the presidency had taken its toll. Truman chose not to run for another term. His party was divided and his popularity had eroded. He left office deeply unpopular, but with a calm dignity. When he handed over the keys to the White House to Dwight D. Eisenhower, Truman returned not to fortune or fanfare, but to Independence, Missouri, and a modest home he and his wife Bess had owned for years. House Part 7. A simple man in a complex world. Life after the presidency. Unlike many modern ex-presidents, Truman did not become wealthy. He refused corporate offers and endorsements. He had no Secret Service protection, no pension, until Congress provided one in 1958, and often walked alone around town or answered his own telephone. He spent his retirement writing memoirs, building his presidential library, and offering blunt, unvarnished opinions to reporters and guests alike. "I never gave anybody hell," he once said. "I just told the truth and they thought it was hell." Over time, the nation's view of him shifted. The decisions he made, once reviled, were re-examined in a new light. Historians began to recognize the courage in his actions, standing up to Stalin, committing to civil rights, rebuilding Europe, and holding the line during the most dangerous years of early nuclear diplomacy. DNA Part 8. Legacy of Fire, Truman's Shadow on History. Harry Truman's presidency laid the foundation for the modern American state. The National Security Act of 1947 created the CIA, Department of Defense, and National Security Council. He transformed America from a wartime giant into a global superpower with permanent global responsibilities. He ushered in the policy of containment, which would define U.S. foreign affairs until the fall of the Berlin Wall. Yet Truman's most haunting legacy remains the atomic bomb. To this day, no other nation has used nuclear weapons in war. Historians, ethicists, and political leaders still debate whether Truman's decision was justified. Was it an act of mercy, ending a horrific war swiftly, or an unforgivable crime against humanity? What's certain is that he understood the gravity. He wasn't a man eager for destruction. He was a man faced with impossible choices, alone at the pinnacle of power, in the most dangerous chapter of human history. Speech Balloon Part 9. The Last Words of a President. In 1972, Harry S. Truman died at the age of 88. Thousands gathered in Independence, not for a king or a conqueror, but for a president who had walked with giants and stood firm. He once said, "The responsibility of great states is to serve and not to dominate the world." Truman didn't seek greatness. He didn't claim to be a genius. But in the darkest hours of the 20th century, when the world needed decisions, he made them. History may forever debate the morality of the bomb, but it will never forget the man who dropped it. Compass Part 10. The Evolving Legacy, Truman Through the Lens of Time. When Harry Truman died in 1972, he was mourned by the nation, but not yet celebrated. In the decades that followed, however, something extraordinary happened. Historians began re-evaluating his presidency. They looked past the chaos of his time in office and began to see the architecture of a new world order, a post-war structure that Truman had helped design almost from scratch. Where others had faltered, Truman had stood firm. Sometimes stubbornly, sometimes imperfectly, but always with clarity of purpose. His decisions were rarely popular in the moment, but they aged with surprising resilience. In 1982, historian David McCullough began researching a biography of Truman. It would take nearly a decade, but when it was published in 1992, simply titled Truman, it reshaped public memory. The book painted him not as a backwater politician who stumbled into greatness, but as a quiet titan, a man of grit, simplicity, and enormous resolve. In 1993, HBO adapted McCullough's work into an Emmy-winning film, with Gary Sinise portraying the president. For a new generation, Truman was no longer just the man who dropped the bomb, he was the man who rebuilt the world afterward. Scroll Part 11. A President for an Uncertain Age. The legacy of Harry Truman gained renewed relevance in the 21st century. As America faced new global challenges, from terrorism to cyber warfare, from China's rise to Russian aggression, leaders and scholars returned to the Truman Doctrine for guidance. How do you respond to authoritarian threats? When do you act? And at what cost? Even in domestic affairs, Truman's early efforts toward civil rights, universal health care, and labor protections gained new appreciation. Though many of his initiatives were blocked in his own time, they anticipated some of the most pivotal social movements of the decades to follow. Barack Obama kept a portrait of Truman in the White House. So did Bill Clinton. Both cited his courage to lead, not follow polls, as a model for their presidencies. In a time when politics often favors flash over substance, Truman's story offers something rare. A reminder that true leadership sometimes looks like plain talk, hard choices, and lonely stands. Globe with Meridians Part 12. A Global Legacy, from Hiroshima to History Books. Of all the questions that surround Truman's presidency, one remains most haunting. Was he right to use the atomic bomb? The answer is neither simple nor comfortable. To some, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were necessary evils, military actions that prevented a bloodier invasion of Japan. To others, they were war crimes, unleashing a horror the world should never forget. But what's beyond dispute is this: Truman's decision launched the nuclear age. Every nuclear policy, every arms treaty, every disarmament negotiation traces its roots to those fateful days in August 1945. Even now, over 75 years later, Hiroshima remains a scar on human memory, and a cautionary monument to power, morality, and the limits of human judgment. World leaders walk in Truman's footsteps every time they enter a war room. Every time a nuclear option is raised, or restrained, they revisit the very path he once walked alone. Classical Building Part 13. The Man Remembered, Truman in American Memory. As the decades passed, Harry S. Truman transitioned from a controversial commander-in-chief to one of the most respected presidents in American history. A man once vilified in office was now honored in textbooks, speeches, and statues, not for being perfect, but for being principled in the face of chaos. In 1957, Truman personally oversaw the opening of the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum in Independence, Missouri. He wanted it to be more than a memorial; it was a house of truth, a place where Americans could study, question, and learn from the past. He often sat in the library's lobby, greeting visitors in his trademark plain-spoken way. "I'm just Harry," he would say. That humility, that raw authenticity became his enduring hallmark. Film Projector Part 14. Culture, Cinema, and the Myth of Truman. Hollywood and literature soon caught on. Truman was no longer just the man behind the bomb, he became an icon of reluctant but righteous power. From books like Truman by David McCullough to films, documentaries, and presidential rankings, he climbed steadily in the public eye. His rise from an unknown farmer to a global leader felt almost mythic, an American story in its purest form. Modern presidents referenced him often. Democrats admired his progressive ideals. Republicans respected his firm hand in foreign affairs. And both sides acknowledged one thing: he never ran from responsibility. Dove Part 15. The Final Measure of the Man. Truman died on December 26, 1972, at the age of 88. At his funeral, there were no grand parades or celebrity eulogies, just the quiet reverence of a grateful nation. A few days later, in a rare public address, President Richard Nixon said, "Harry Truman's life reminds us that greatness is not born of charisma or wealth, but from duty, conviction, and integrity." Even now, his words echo in American consciousness. The buck stops here. It is amazing what you can accomplish if you do not care who gets the credit. America was not built on fear. It was built on courage, on imagination, and an unbeatable determination to do the job at hand. Globe showing Europe-Africa Epilogue, the world he built. Truman's legacy is not carved in stone, but written into the systems and values that define the modern world. He helped create the United Nations, NATO, the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, the CIA, NSA, and modern national security state, a nuclear policy still debated to this day, and a vision of America as a global guardian of democracy. His decisions, shocking, bold, and often lonely, gave birth to the Cold War, reshaped foreign policy, and offered a blueprint for how power can be used not for conquest, but for containment and stability. He did not live to see the Berlin Wall fall, the Soviet Union collapse, or communism retreat from Europe. But make no mistake, his fingerprints are on every page of that story. Harry S. Truman, the farmer from Missouri, changed the world, not with charm or rhetoric but with will, steel, and a simple belief in doing what was right no matter the cost. Film frame's final word. He didn't ask for greatness. He inherited crisis. He didn't chase glory. He carried burden. He didn't fear hard choices. He made them. Harry S. Truman, the president who dropped the bomb and the man who rebuilt a world from its ashes.